I need what it was. And I will tell when to. No, my God. See. Okay. That's okay.
Excellent. I think we're all ready now. So welcome again to the 5th or 6th of Slavoj's masterclasses. Just one announcement. As we said right from the beginning, Slavoj will have an extra session next Wednesday at 2 o'clock, in which people will be free to ask him any kind of question around their work or in relation to his work. That will be next Wednesday at 2 o'clock, but we have not as yet booked the room. This was decided on this day, so we will let you know which room this extra session will take place on Thursday. So there is the masterclass finishes next Tuesday, and then on Wednesday we will have this additional session for general discussion. So we go back to Hegel and politics. Slav.
Thank you very much. First, apology. I will break my word. Nonetheless, I couldn't resist the temptation of showing you again from Hitchcock and from Casablanca one short and one longer clip to exchange. Point two, I inquired a little bit around, and the message, I mean among you, the people, and the message I got was unambiguous, that they consider not appropriate the large majority to engage in a substantial, how to put it, Buddhist debate now. So what I propose is that we reserve that for next Wednesday, a substantial part for, because, I mean, we can do it. Okay, so second point, because we are approaching the last third, we are in it today. What I propose is that today I stick to Hegelian topic, explained through some movies, through Chesterton and so on. We conclude this. You have only to suffer today. Then, 2 days from now on Thursday, I go first in a more abstract way I will approach the question of intellectual engagement. What modes of intellectual engagement are we confronting today? How do they function? Basically, political engagement, of course. Basically, I will focus on two figures, Michel Foucault and Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, because I don't know if you noticed it, but I think there is a surprising parallel between the two of them. It's clear that what for Heidegger was his Nazi engagement, for Foucault it was his, unfortunate for some people, not for me, Iranian engagement. And in Foucault you really have it's incredible if you read it closely how similar the reaction is of Foucault. This withdrawal into aesthetics of self and so on and so on. So this also in a more general way, my target will be a certain figure of intellectual sustained by a social analyst whom I appreciate very much, otherwise Judith Butler's partner, Wendy Brown. Her idea confronting somebody like Nietzsche, who is at the same time aggressive, brutal, outspoken, iconoclastic, but also inappropriate, anti-democratic, anti-feminist. Her idea is that intellectuals like this are very useful as a kind of a self-critical supplement to democracy. We need them to steer up things, but we should be afraid that what they are proposing are not political projects that had to be enacted properly. I think that this is, to accept this role of a public clown is the worst that can happen to an intellectual. I will radically oppose this idea, because you know, about this I want to talk the next time. You know where Nietzsche is the problem for me? I'm more and more horrified at how Nietzsche's popularity today is, at least I think, at the very level of writing, stylistically if you want, a betrayal of Nietzsche. Where is all that ruthless brutality of Nietzsche? I mean, for example, the feminists who appropriate Nietzsche, but are they aware in what style, I always like to quote, Nietzsche was writing? For example, what he wrote, his passages on George Sand, where he said George Sand is like a fat cow with her breasts dried of any milk or something like this and so on. Now, imagine somebody writing about a big feminist like Judith Butler is a thin cow and her breasts are also thin and so on. I mean, you are crucified immediately. Now you will say it's good, this is brutal. Okay, but then drop Nietzsche. Just don't play with Nietzsche then. This is for me the ABC of Nietzsche, this brutality. If you drop this, you get a kind of a politically correct Nietzsche who, my God, okay, more of this, we go deeply in, and this is what interests me, how this typical ambiguity of intellectuals, they are fascinated with a strong figure, Heidegger with Hitler and so on, and then they withdraw. My point would have been, of course, that they shouldn't have withdrawn, that they, instead of grasping, for example, Heidegger, apropos Hitler, that it wasn't nihilism of Hitler, violence, blah, blah, but that the problem of Hitler was, and I know this will sound shocking, that he wasn't violent enough for me. That is to say that the violence of Hitler, anti-Semitic and so on, was a false, impotent acting out. Hitler didn't dare to touch where it would really hurt. To put it here, I'm a very old-fashioned Marxist, to disturb the mode of production, however you call it, and so on. And all Hitler's violence was basically an impotent acting out. So, this idea how thinkers are obsessed, fascinated by a strong leader, then they burn their fingers and withdraw, that's what I wanted to oppose. But this is next time. Today, this is obviously, you may have guessed that I have intimate problems with Stalinism, that I deserve, it's a topic for analysis here, how should I put it? No, okay, I do know some good British analysts whom I would have trusted, like my friend Darian Leader. Unfortunately, him being my friend disqualifies him for me for being my analyst, no? But wait a minute, the last time I met him, he told me, I think I already mentioned this to you, he told me a wonderful thing. He told me, undoubtedly, Daphne du Maurier is much better writer than Virginia Woolf. Absolutely agree. So how couldn't I? And I did it. Okay. But I cannot do this, so you will have to suffer a little bit more. But nonetheless, I want to, and again, there will be a couple of repetitions with something that I already published, but the line is new. I want to, at a very general level, in order to provide you with another approach, but don't be too much afraid. This approach will lead us through Hitchcock's Torn Curtain and Casablanca, to the basic shift matrix, if you want, formal matrix of Hegel's dialectics. I want to start maybe with a surprising example. You know Gorgias, the pupil of Parmenides, the founding figure, at least from our perspective. We don't know what really went on there. And this would be, if some of you write seminars, just not for me, please, a nice topic of narrative historical analysis. How, for example, when you say Parmenides, we identify him with these short fragments, 1-2-liners. No, I mean, but are we aware that Parmenides didn't sit down in the afternoon and said to himself, now I will write a deep fragment, like being and thinking are the same. He was basically writing long, boring poems. And it's the same as, this is my favorite example of relation to ancient Greece. There was a great scandal in Hollywood, I remember, when a rich Arab, one of those princes on whose vulgarity Western media like to focus in their racist way, bought an authentic Greek statue and put it on the garden of his villa in Beverly Hills and painted it. Now, you laugh, but you know that originally they were painted. That's the point, that the idea that we have this white marble beauty, this is not it. Original Greece was one big kitsch factory. The Disneyland can disappear in front of that. So, you see what we are making of history. Okay, so let's approach this original sophist figure, Gorgias, on nature or on the non-existent. The text, which, as we all know, survived only in summary form in Sextus Empiricus and is mentioned then in Aristoteles, some of Aristoteles' works, and so on and so on. The thesis of Gorgias that he develops there can be summed up in 3 propositions. This is, as maybe some of you know, sophism, sophistic dialectics at its most crazy. A, nothing exists. B, if anything existed, it could not be known. C, if anything did exist and could be known, it could not be communicated to others. Like total zero, total nihilism. Although, interestingly enough, Gorgias, as far as we can reconstruct his lines, meant this as a defense of Parmenides, because when he says nothing exists, he meant no particular being. This was meant, again, as a defense of Parmenides, only the one exists, and so on and so on. Okay. I will try to establish a link between this and Stalinism. As a kind of, again, trying to discern the basic matrix, and then I will try to show where Hegel stands here. The first thing to observe, if there ever was a clear case of the Freudian logic of the borrowed cattle, you know, I use it extensively in my Iraq book and so on, where you provide mutually exclusive reasons. You know, I didn't borrow from you the cattle, I borrowed it, but I returned it unbroken, and it was already broken, and so on. We have it here. First, nothing exists. B, something does exist, but it cannot be known. C, we know things, but we cannot communicate them to others. The underlying formal structure here is that of Platonic diaresis. Let's put that this is existence. Things either don't exist or exist. If they exist, they cannot be known or can be known. If they can be known, they cannot be communicated or they can be communicated. You got this. No, it's kind of each genus is divided into two species. And the Gorgias position is here. Nothing occurred. The problem being that in order to get from here to here, you have to admit the truth of this. Now, what has this to do with Stalinism? My first claim is that exactly the same structure, the same gradual division of genus into species, the next species subdivided, we find it in Stalin at a general level and in his political practice. And that this is, at its most formal, elementary, the formal structure of even Stalinist political purges. It's Stalin enumerated, you can get the text, but it's stupid to read on internet, the short text on dialectical and historical materialism. He enumerates there 4 features of Marxist dialectics. First, contrary metaphysics is always the bad guy. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics claim that, contrary to metaphysics, which claim that reality is just a contingent agglomeration of things, dialectic claims that everything is connected, that reality builds an organically collected whole. Next feature, according to Stalin, contrary to metaphysics, which claims that reality is in a state of immobility, Parmenidean immobility, dialectic claims that reality is in a continuous movement and change. Next feature, contrary to dialectics, which regards movement as a simple quantitative movement of things slowly developed, dialectics considers movement as qualitative movement, jumps, breaks. The last features, in contrast to dialectics, which thinks that things just change continually through peaceful evolution, dialectic thinks that things change in struggle, through struggle of opposites and so on and so on. Why? Because now already you see my point, how we pass from here to here. Stalin appears to distinguish 4 features as metaphysics, dialectics, vertically. But what is he really doing is a horizontal subdivision, because reality is composed either of a totality or of agglomeration of individual objects. This totality is either immobile or mobile. If it's mobile, it develops in a peaceful, gradual way, or qualitative jumps, if qualitative jumps, and so on and so on. So, but the trick of Stalin, and I will develop what I'm aiming at, is that he reads this diagonal division as vertical division. What do I mean by this? first, again, nature is not a conglomerate of dispersed phenomena, but a connected whole. Then this whole is not immobile, but in constant movement and change. Then this change is not only gradual, quantitative drifting, but involves qualitative jumps. Finally, this qualitative development is not a matter of harmonious deployment, but is propelled by the struggle of opposite. So the trick is here that we are not dealing only with this Platonic diaresis, because the underlying premise is that this diagonal process of division is really vertical. That is to say that we are dealing with different aspects of one and the same division. To put it in Stalinist jargon, an immobile whole is not really a whole, but just a conglomerate of elements. Development, which does not involve qualitative jumps, is not really a development, but just an immobile stepping at the same place. A qualitative change, which does not involve struggle of the opposite, is not really a change at all, but just a quantitative, monotonous movement. Or, now you will get my point, to put it in more ominous terms. Let's say that you advocate this point. Stalin's point would have been, you may pretend that you endorse this, but really, objectively, you are for this. And that's the political logic. Let us say class struggle. My God, this elevation is mystical. Let's say class struggle, you are on the bourgeoisie or social democracy. Let's say in social democracy, you are just a Christian socialist or a Marxist. Let's say as a Marxist, you are a Menshevik, softy, or a Bolshevik. You see, this would be the normal Platonic diaresis, but the whole point of Stalin is that if you are a Menshevik, you are objectively just a liberal. If you are liberal, you are objectively, you know that, or to put it in more political terms, put this first distinction Stalin threw out Trotskyist, then Zinoviev and so on, but he reads the last subdivision as retroactive. We have class struggle, friend, enemy. Then we have first generation enemy, second generation enemy, but each of them collapses back. And this is then the united front of the enemies, where he can say to be a Trotskyite is not just a subdivision among us Bolsheviks. It means objectively to be a Menshevik revisionist. To be a Menshevik revisionist doesn't mean to be just a liberal, unacceptable subdivision of progressive movement. It means objectively to be on the other side for the bourgeoisie and so on. So you get my point. Although the division gets finer and finer, all the time it's treated as a horizontal division, where the tiniest distinction within our camp is projected back as horizontally as the great distinction itself. This, I think, is what accounts for two famous quips or almost slips of tongue of Stalin, to which I often refer. You know that when Stalin answered the question, already in 28, which deviation is worst, the rightist or the leftist one? You know what his answer was? Not they are both equally bad, but they are both worse. The underlying premise was again that the leftist deviation is really objectively not leftist at all, but a concealed rightist one. Or another, even nicer example. When Stalin wrote in a report on a party congress that the delegates, quote, with the majority of votes, unanimously approved the resolution of the Central Committee. You got with the majority unanimously. The underlying premise is that there was really no minority. Those who voted against thereby excluded themselves from the party. You know, you don't get the political field, the enemy and us, minority, majority. The moment you are minority, you fall back here. You fall back there. There is only one division. That is to say, in all these cases, the universal genus repeatedly overlaps with or fully coincides with one of its species. This is what allows Stalin to read history retroactively, so that things become clear retroactively. It was not that Trotsky, as common sense would have told us, was first fighting for the revolution with Lenin and Stalin, and then at a certain stage opted for a different strategy than the one advocated by Stalin. This last opposition, Trotsky-Stalin, makes it clear how objectively Trotsky was against the revolution all the time. So then you get this wonderful paradox that basically Trotsky saved the revolution through organizing Red Army in order to be able to betray it later or whatever. Now I will give you a nice detailed example of how this structure is subjectivized. It will be a little bit of historical detail, but please be patient, follow it, because I think it's a wonderful example of politicization of discourse. You know that when there was the forced collectivization from 28 till 33, Stalinist ideologists and political activists got always caught in some kind of a classificatory deadlock when they tried to classify the enemy. What is the class structure of the peasants, farmers in the village? They wanted to crush the rich peasants' kulaks' resistance. So, to be Marxist, to act like Marxist, they divided peasants into three categories, classes, subclasses, whatever. The poor peasants, they were defined objectively as those who have no land or minimal land, who work for others. Then, they are, of course, the natural allies of the workers. The poor in the countryside, our allies. Then, the autonomous middle peasants, who oscillate between the exploited and the exploiters. They are so-so. We should a little bit pressure on them, but get them on our side. And then, the rich peasants, so-called kulaks, employing other workers, lending them money or seeds, and so on and so on. They are the exploiting class enemy. As Stalin put it, they had to be liquidated as a class. It's incidentally a wonderful, ambiguous expression, liquidated as a class. Because does this mean they have all to be liquidated, or they should just be liquidated as a class while individuals can join us? And everything, of course, depended, okay. However, the problem was that in practice, this classification became more and more blurred and inoperative in the generalized poverty. Clear criteria no longer applied, and other two categories, poor farmers and middle, autonomous middle farmers often rejoined kulaks in their resistance to forced collectivization. So, now comes the wonderful thing. So, in the early 30s, the Stalinist discourse introduced a new category, very interesting one, that of a, like, how do you call it, subculture, subkulak. A peasant who, although with regard to his economic situation, was too poor to be considered a kulak proper, nonetheless shared the kulak's counter-revolutionary attitude. This mysterious category of subkulak was thus, here I quote, I'm not afraid to quote the enemies if one can learn something from them, Robert Conquest's Harvest of Sorrow, quote, subkulak was a term without any real social content, even by Stalinist standards, but merely, rather unconvincingly, masquerading as such. As was officially stated, by kulak we mean the carrier of certain political tendencies which are most frequently discernible in the subkulak, male and female. By this means, any peasant whatever was liable to dekulakization, and the subkulak notion was widely employed, enlarging the category of victims greatly beyond the official estimate of kulaks proper, and so on and so on. So, no wonder that the official ideologists finally renounced the very effort to provide an objective definition of kulak. Another quote, the grounds given in one Soviet comment are that the old attitudes of a kulak have almost disappeared, and the new ones do not lend themselves to recognition. So the art of identifying a kulak was no longer a matter of objective social analysis. If you have so many cows, or if you employ other workers, you are a kulak. It became a matter of a very complex hermeneutics of suspicion, of identifying one's true political attitudes hidden beneath deceiving public proclamations. So that even in Pravda, they wrote that, quote, even the best activists often cannot spot the kulak. What all this points towards is, again, the dialectical mediation of the subjective and objective dimension. Sub-kulak no longer designated an objective social category. You get my point? Even if it was masked as that, we divide kulak into kulak proper and sub-kulak. Effectively, it designated the point at which objective social analysis breaks down and subjective political attitude directly inscribes itself into the objective order. In Lacanian terms, sub-kulak was the point of subjectivization of the objective chain, poor peasant, middle peasant, kulak. It was not an objective subcategory or subdivision of the class of kulaks, but simply the name for the kulakist subjective political attitude. This accounts for the paradox that although it appeared as a subdivision of the class of kulaks, sub-kulaks was a species which overflew its own genus. Sub-kulaks all of a sudden were to be found anywhere. There were poor farmers who were sub-kulaks. There were middle farmers who were sub-kulaks. So you see the point. The point is precisely that kulak, when it became blurred, everybody was poor, was starving, so who is a kulak? So they introduced another division, sub-kulak, which means even if you are not a kulak, you are all this, at all levels. You can be everywhere. You know, from an objective category, it passes into almost like a Jew, something which has to be detected, they are masked, it can be everywhere. The point of, again, subjectivization. And to go even further, back to Gorgias, I think one should read Gorgias' argumentation in the same way. It may appear that Gorgias proceeds in three consequent divisions. First, things exist or not. Then, if they exist, they can be known or not. Then, if they can be known, we can communicate this knowledge to others or not. However, the truth of this gradual subdivision is, again, the repetition of one and the same line of division. If we cannot communicate something to others, it means that we really do not know it ourselves. You see? Let's again play it. Things exist, don't exist, exist. If they exist, we don't know them, we know them. If we know them, we cannot communicate them, we can communicate them. But the logic is the same. If we cannot communicate things, it's because really we don't know them. What you really know, you can communicate it. If we don't know things, it means they don't exist. Because what exists, we can know it. So it's the same collapse of diagonal into a vertical line of division. But what would have been here the Hegelian or Lacanian position? I claim the exact reversal. That is to say, it's not only that in order to say the truth, we need the detour through falsity or whatever. It's that we can only speak about things that don't exist. It's to turn it around. And I don't mean this kind of a mysticism. My God, I will refer to your best English instincts. This is the whole point of the Bentham's theory of fictions. That in order to consistently speak about something, you must minimally fictionalize it. That speak as such involves fictionalization. Read Bentham, it's worth reading. I don't know why Verso doesn't want to reprint the book which is long sold out, that selection that I published in my series of Bentham's theories of fiction. Because I think it's a very tragic text, Bentham's. First, he wants to do in the good analytic tradition to divide all categories into real words which designate really existing objects and fictitious entity like wealth, honesty, whatever. But then all of a sudden he's forced to admit that although you can distinguish between fictitious and real terms, if you erase fictions out of language, you lose reality itself. That to talk consistently about reality, you need fictions. And even a step. So again, it's not only that we can speak about fictions, we can even go further. That not only we can talk about things. First it is that we, in order to know things, and know means to articulate them rationally, we have to include things which doesn't exist. I mean, this is the whole point, for example, of Plato's sophist, that you can talk about non-existing things. And we should go a step further here. No, to include reference to non-existence is a condition of human speech. And, this would be a more Lacanian twist, in order to talk, you must also talk. Talking always involves saying more than you intended, which means precisely talking about what you don't know. Again, to return to Donald Rumsfeld, ontology, things you don't know that you know. So you got my point, what I wanted, that for a properly dialectical approach, it's here that it's the truth. It's very anti-Stalinist, at least in this sense, is that, no, it's on the contrary. To communicate or to talk, you must, it goes like, it's almost the opposite. It's not you can talk about things that you know. It's on the, you can only, ultimately, in order to talk about things, you must include what you don't know. Okay, to put it in more standard deconstructionist, bombastic terms, talking always involves a certain autonomy of the medium. You say more than you wanted to say, and so on, and so on, and so on. If you think I'm dreaming, then I propose you, and you can check it on the internet, maybe I even already mentioned it, a wonderful text, one of the miracles of the epoch of German idealism, which, although he was a critique of idealism, was nonetheless deeply indebted to it. You know, Heinrich von Kleist, the great guy, the best short stories, dramas, and so on. He wrote, it would be too much to analyze it in detail, I should. My friend Kostas is teaching me this, resist temptations to talk too much, because then if I talk too much, I maybe a little bit too much talk about what I don't know how to put it. From 1805, but first published 70 years later, you find the English translation on the internet, a wonderful text called, about 15 pages, on the gradual formation of thoughts in the process of speech, which is really all this text, it's wonderful. I mean, you think that we invented things in the 20th century deconstruction. It's there. And why this text is so precious? Because the link with German idealism is clear. The thesis is how you can say something original, even if you let yourself be surprised by your own words. When you know what you say, it will be worthless. And he gives wonderful analysis, intimate and rhetorical, from French Revolution, that famous, I forgot it, reply of Mirabeau, I don't know, one of the big guys who replied to the king. It was, he, Kleist, reconstruct the whole line, claiming how, line by line, how this guy got caught into a certain deadlock. First, the guy wanted to reply to the king's envoy in a standard rhetorical way. Then he made a slip and his rhetorics got screwed up. You know, a slip like my favorite, you must know it. It really happened. I didn't know. I thought first it's too good to be true, it's invented. You know that famous George Bush, when he said, the enemy is getting ready to fight us, and we are also getting ready. The enemy wants to do blah, 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 and then at the end he made this slip. The enemy is doing everything possible to hurt United States, and so are we. You know that famous. This is the biggest rhetorical moment of. Kleist's idea is that after a mess like that, you can see how this guy, sorry, I forgot his name, had quickly to invent something to get out of this mess. And that's how one of the most famous phrases of French Revolution came up. So again, the idea is that of this temporality, where originality is not I know what I want to say and I try to express it, but I let myself be surprised by my very process of enunciation. Here is a wonderful quote 4 lines, don't be afraid, from Kleist. If, therefore, a thought is expressed in a fuzzy way, then it does not at all follow that this thought was conceived in a confused way. On the contrary, it is quite possible that the ideas that are expressed in the most confusing fashion are the ones that were thought out most clearly, and so on and so on. So, again, the idea is that creative ideas emerge when you started in a properly Hegelian way, dialectical way, through failure. You want to say something. Things go wrong, then to save your skin, as it were, you quickly shift the field, or reinterpret failures. At that point it emerges. In other words, but I was already doing a lot of this now when I was talking about this, how necessity emerges out of contingency and so on. Now I want to draw attention to another, maybe surprising for you, aspect here, which is how this procedure involves the notion of symptom. There is a line that they both share, both being Lacan and Walter Benjamin. This idea of symptoms as signs which come from the future. It's anti-Jungian reading. The Jungian reading being symptoms point towards some deep repressed, substantial unconscious. No, for Lacan, and he uses already in his first seminar on Freud's technical writings, this science fiction metaphor of the timeline being inverted, so that so that you have a symptom which is a symptom of something, but that of what is symptom comes afterwards. Like the nice paradox is you first have a symptom. This is how I propose, I hope you will find this at least modestly amusing, to read Lacan's well-known phrase, woman is a symptom of man. Not only we men really exist, and then, although this thesis, as I already mentioned it here, is very popular in today's spiritual cinema. Like, I was shocked if you saw Tarkovsky's Solaris. My God, this is pure Weininger in this worst sense, that the idea is that the woman only exists as the materialization of Chris, the hero's guilt. And the whole point is that the woman can only demonstrate her true love by literally burning herself with poison, erasing herself to set the man free. Why do I like this example? Because it shows clearly the paradox of our intellectual predicament. If somebody were clearly to announce, just to articulate the implicit sexual ontology of Tarkovsky's film, Solaris, one wouldn't even be denounced as a male chauvinist but simply ridiculous. It's too crazy even for today's standards. But if he does it with all this spiritual Russian pathos, it's great art and so on. Okay, but I think that the way we should stick to this Lacan's formula, woman is a symptom of man, but I think this is a wonderful formula to see symptom not as this secondary sound, but the notion, which is, I think, a wonderful dialectical notion of an autonomous symptom. Like a woman is, for me, some merry being who says, I'm a symptom. Would you accept me as your symptom? A symptom freely floating around, who would be? Whose symptom should I be? And so on. This is, I think, and the man is then the idiot, It's not that the man can pick her up. No, I don't want to be your symptom. Fuck off and so on. And what is then the man? I think that the other side, Lacan doesn't develop it, it's clear. If woman is a symptom of man, man is woman's fantasy. That's, I think, how, for example, one has to read Lacan's thesis that Don Juan is feminine fantasy. This, he can always do it, permanent erection, whatever, it's woman's fantasy. Okay, but so what's the idea here? Again, the idea is that part of this strange temporality where, how to put it, the progress of language is not that the underlying deep idea pre-exists the process, but it emerges through a slip, a failure. You do it, there is a symptomatic failure, you fail, but this symptomatic failure does not mean that. And this is, I think, how one should properly read Freud's, this Fehlleistungen, splits of tongue. It's not that the deep meaning is already there. It's rather that you fail, and then to account for the failure, retroactively afterwards you produce meaning. And I think I couldn't resist showing you this. I think that the same goes also for art. Where is here the connection with Benjamin? You know that Benjamin writes apropos of art, how often some artistic products appear as symptoms. He doesn't use the term, but he says signs coming from the future. He uses this photographic metaphor, that it's as if we get film shots, but we do not yet possess the developers to properly develop the image. That sometimes avant-garde work of art are like film shots which we have to wait for a later epoch. For example, one of the ideas would have been that a lot of painting or photography around the turn of the century reached like a kind of a forward running, trying to imitate in advance cinematic movement, as if cinema was not yet invented, but they try to imitate it. They can only properly be read once we know cinema. And also, I don't, for example, if you like it, I don't, it's too childish, too innocent, he's not evil enough for me. But for example, it's clear, very popular, Juan Miró, the Spanish painter, no? It's clear that his later paintings, all those, they are already there as elements in his early work. So this is the proper dialectical progress. How something which was part of an organic whole gets autonomized. Okay, what's my point here now? Now comes the surprise. Now please, can you, the bright technicians, enter and raise this? Now comes the extremely complicated gesture. While, let's see if it works, yes. This goes up. Oh yeah, rather the other one goes down, yes. I want to show you a scene from one of Hitchcock's neglected masterpieces. It's really a bad film. Did you see Hitchcock's Torn Curtain? It's almost as bad as Topaz, which is really the... Okay. It's towards the end of the film when the couple of Julie Andrews and Paul Newman, they found themselves in an East Berlin theater. The Stasi, communist police, tries to arrest them, and they are witnessing a ballet performance of, that's crucial, Tchaikovsky, Francesca da Rimini ballet. The reason I wanted to show you this one was because of music. Because I think there is even in this way, it's very private reason that I want to show you. Okay, for two reasons. The less important reason is that you will see this very Lacanian idea of gaze as the fixated moment in the image. Because the ballerina, who is a bad communist ballerina, we learn at the beginning of the film, the ballerina observes them in the hall while she's dancing, and you will see how, in an almost ridiculously exaggerated way, it's her fixed gaze that signals it. Then the ballerina calls the policeman, yes. But listen attentively to the music. Because, can you wait for 1 second before you pray? Yeah, because... Sorry? My God, this is really, now it's a matter for, you know, this is the third time it happens, and I will tell you something. When I was young, I read Ian Fleming's Goldfinger, and then at the beginning you have a deep thought, which is, once is a chance, twice is a coincidence, the third time is an enemy action. No? If we talk about Stalinism and so on. No? Okay, let's hope that this will work, because what shocked me so much is that I am an Adornian. Tchaikovsky, you cannot get lower, and so on. But in the middle of this typical Tchaikovskyan romantic music, you get a couple of, just a short melodic line, which, my God, sounds as pure 20th century Bernard Herrmann. When I first saw this, I didn't know it's Tchaikovsky. I thought, my God, this is Bernard Herrmann. That is the same as in, you remember in The Man Who Knew Too Much, second version, where the Royal Albert Hall performance, when Doris Day screams, it is his music. Okay, it's more complex. I thought it's, and then I discovered it's Tchaikovsky. Then I went, of course, I bought a CD with Francesca da Rimini, and I discovered, at least from our sensitivity, it sticks out so clearly. It's as if we get, even in Tchaikovsky, how should I call it, signal from future. No? A totally different tone of music which Tchaikovsky wasn't aware, but today with us we can see what it is. So I wanted to show you this too. For this reason, this short clip. Again, this musical wonder. I think that if you know a little bit Hitchcock's films, this typical tonality of more Schoenbergian and so on, of the music by Bernard Herrmann, you will immediately say, but what's happening here? But this is not Tchaikovsky. I couldn't have believed it. And I didn't want to test the fate too much, because my original goal was to play to you first as an orchestral clip fragment this music. Why? I couldn't resist the temptation, because I bought, of all places, in a small store, CD store in a black part of Chicago, very close to the house of that Muslim leader Louis Farrakhan. I bought, it's unbelievable, a CD with, among others, this Tchaikovsky music. Okay, you will see it now. Okay, without music, this ridiculous of. Oh, yes, sir. It's a little bit ridiculous even. It's fixed gaze, blah, blah, blah. But the whole point is music. Okay, maybe it works even better with. Now she informs them, so Amerikanische Spionen or whatever she. But oh my God, what's going on here? The whole point is music. So again, you have all this. You know, it's like kind of a primitive Lacanianism of Hitchcock, almost too direct. But the music did work. The sound. Okay, you know what I propose? I mean, that I go on simply, and then afterwards, when they do it, we return to that. Okay. It's the idea here of this symptomatic structure of reality and language. It's again, we are back at that idea of, let's call it ontological openness. That there is a fuzziness inscribed into language. Like, let me give you another example of what I'm aiming at with this symptomal structure. That you have first a symptom and then you reconstruct the music. You know that famous Lincoln, the American president, Lincoln's speech. You can fool all the people some of the time. You can fool some of the people all the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. Well, Daniel Dennett was not the first to draw attention to the fact that it's absolutely not clear what is meant here. It can be read in two opposed ways. It can mean that there are, what does it mean? You can fool all and some people all the time. Does it mean that there are always, there are some people who can be fooled all the time? Like, I cannot fool you all the time, this evening. But there is, okay, I will not. Okay, me. But there is somebody who is stupid enough who can be fooled all the time? Or does it mean at any moment there is at least one idiot who can be fooled, but it's not always the same? And then it provides, I think, a nice reading of this. It's wrong to ask what did Lincoln really mean. You just got idea, oh, this sounds nice, research. You know, it's open in reality itself. We complete it today, the way we want. It's open, the meaning is open in reality itself. So, this is the structure, that you produce something which is in itself open, and again, retroactively you can fix it in any way you want. That would have been the elementary, what I call it, structure of the real in language. Because this element, which is at the same point an obstacle and the generative moment, this obstacle, the failure is productive. You have to get lost in order to generate the new. This would be the, to use this bombastic term, the dialectical moment of the unity of the opposites. So, in other words, let's return to a brief point about the real here. You know, the Lacanian real is definitely not. Here we see the real implies the structure of the unity of the opposite. The real is not something out there which forever eludes us. We cannot grasp it, it's too strong, whatever. We forever fail, every symbolization fail. It's like that which you try to grasp it, it eludes your grasp. The real is the thing to which you cannot get never a direct access. But it's also the opposite itself. What prevents you from getting the access to reality? That, let's say, the blind spot in your eye. What disturbs clear image of reality is again the real. So you get the point that the obstacle in you which prevents you to see the way things are, and things in themselves, they are the same. That what out there avoids you is here what prevents you to get it. So that the real is not out there avoiding you, it's the real is your gaze itself, to cut a long story short, the partial character of your gaze itself. This can be done in a very nice way, precisely apropos, if this is not clear. Let me give you a simple example, trauma. Okay, can I enter now, please? Because I know where to jump. So, but stay here, please, just to be sure. Because now, yes. Voice, more voice, what? Usual romantic music. Here is Hitchcock. Here you can see how it gets recuperated with standard romantic tone again. Okay, it was a little bit naive, but if you know Hitchcock's films, I hope you got the point, how strange it sounded. And again, I couldn't have believed it. I was absolutely sure this can be only Bernard Herrmann. No, it is Tchaikovsky. But let me return to it. Let's take a trauma. You had a traumatic experience. Something terrible happened to you. You were witnessing a torture, or you were tortured, or whatever. Okay, stop it just now, because I need some little bit of time. Okay, thanks very much. On the one hand, of course, you cannot confront the trauma directly. So it's the inaccessible transcendence. Like, you avoid the place, you cannot represent it, you can only detect it through displays, signs, and so on. It's too much for you to confront the scene directly. But isn't it at the same time that which in you, not out there, colors and distorts all your other perceptions? Like, I look at this, somehow it reminds me of the trauma, it's twisted, and so on. So you see, it's At the same time, not enough and too much. Not enough in the sense out there avoids you, you cannot confront it directly, but at the same time, it's all the time here giving this particular twist, distorting your perceptions. So I think that this unity is absolutely crucial for the Lacanian real, that it's in the same time that which is always distorting that which can only be represented in a distorted way, but at the same time, that which distorts your perception. That's the real. That's the real. In other words, we have already here a nice speculative formula, which is the central Hegelian formula, namely that the very gap that separates you from the object, the very gap between you and, let's say, divine object in Christianity, is what includes you into it, is part of the object itself, of the thing itself. What do I mean by it? I know I already approached it the last time, but I want now to give you a couple of examples which I hope you will like a little bit. Again, sorry for having to suffer a little bit of Sovietology the last time. I always am following with true passion this debate. I don't know if you like classical music, about Shostakovich, but also Prokofiev. Namely, the problem is how are we to read Shostakovich's popular works, Fifth Symphony, Seventh, and so on. Was he a truly pro-Soviet composer, or was it that privately he mocked the content? So the idea is then that if we have this triumphant, bombastic finale of the Fifth Symphony, of the Seventh Leningrad Symphony, that it's wrong for us to say, but it's banal, bombastic. It's meant to be like that. It's meant to be an ironic self-denunciation of Stalinism. So we arrive in this way at this Shostakovich theory that, of Shostakovich, that Shostakovich was a closet dissident who was apparently following the party line, but at the same time reserving a private space for his despairs, and so on and so on. So again, the problem being, what was the real Shostakovich here? Was he the big official composer with maybe some doubts, or was he a closet dissident? My solution is here a very simple and radical one. He was a true Soviet composer, but not in spite of these private dissident doubts, but because of them. That is to say, to be truly a Soviet composer, it was demanded to not simply directly stage Soviet ideology, but to do it in this ironic, to do it through a certain distance. In other words, what we have to do is to read Shostakovich symphonies like Casablanca. Now comes Casablanca. Maybe you know the example, but nonetheless, again, I cannot resist the temptation of interpreting this wonderful fragment again, and then, making the point. It's let's now hope with sincere humility that it will go. It's the scene, of course, the night.
With the coming of the second...
I'm sorry, but this will last a minute or two. No, half a minute, because it's 29. We have to come to 29, and there is no way here to jump directly. Incidentally,
Good night. You will not find a treasure.
It was just a ring, monsieur.
Good luck. How's the lady life treating you? My wife? Yes.
Yes. Okay, here we are. Incidentally, well, this is the scene, you know, when Ingrid Bergman comes to Humphrey Bogart to ask him to give her, to provide the visas for her and her heroic husband, Victor Laszlo.
I told you this morning you'd come around, but this is a little ahead of schedule. Well, won't you sit down?
While we come to the point, to the short scene that I want to show you,
Unexpected visit isn't connected by any chance with letters of transit.
Umberto Eco has a wonderful note on Casablanca where he points out a strange detail, that Victor Laszlo, the heroic husband, who is supposed to be this ascetic feature, sacrificing that, displays a very strange feature. Almost in every scene, whenever he is in an inn, in a locale, ordering a drink, he orders a different drink, a very exotic one, like a Pernod, this kind of martini, that one. And
Richard,
Eco's
we loved each other once.
Eco's theory is wonderful, that we shouldn't read this as a psychological sign that there is some deeper decadent
You knew
aspect,
what really happened. You
secret enjoyer, but it's simply that
You say anything?
it's prosopopeia. They are not real persons. They were simply putting together fragments for different scenes. That it's not psychological unity.
You're sorry for yourself, don't you? There's so much at stake, all you can think of.
Okay, let's enjoy 1 minute. and
One
then-
woman is hurt you, you take your revenge on the rest of the world. You're a coward and weakling. No. Richard, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but you are our last hope. If you don't help us, Victor Laszlo will die in Casablanca.
What of it? I'm going to die in Casablanca. It's a good spot for it. Now, if you...
All right. I tried to reason with you. I tried everything. Now I want those letters. Get them for me.
I don't have to. I got them right here.
Put them on the table.
No.
For the last time, put them on the table.
If Laszlo and the cause mean so much to you, you won't stop at anything. All right, I'll make it easier for you. Go ahead and shoot. You'll be doing me a favor.
Richard, I tried to stay away. I thought I would never see you again. That you were out of my life. The day you left Paris, if you knew what I went through, if you knew how much I loved you, how much I still love you.
And then?
It wasn't long after we were married that Victor went back to Czechoslovakia. They needed him in Prague, but that got...
Okay, that was it. Now it's only me talking, so no possible traumas. Okay, so what happens here? Of course, apart from other things, like Casablanca itself would have been a nice example of that retroactive structuring of meaning, but unfortunately it's not true. You know that myth that they didn't know what the ending will be. They did know. It's not true that while they were shooting it, they didn't know will Ingrid Bergman stay with whom she will stay and so on. But maybe some of you know the analysis. I want to repeat it here to make my central Hegelian ideological point clear and then go on to Shostakovich music and to Hegel again. Namely, what happens in this final half a minute? They embrace, lights go out, then we see that tower of the airport, light turning around, then we return to the same room, the same conversation seems to be going on, Humphrey Bogart smoking a cigarette, says it then to her, and okay, she resumes her story. Of course, the question is, did they do it or not in between? That is to say, those 3.5 seconds, what do they stand for? Is this just real 3.5 seconds, or are they standing for, I don't know, whatever you want, from 5 minutes to 1 hour, whatever, things happening? I'm following here wonderful analysis by Richard Maltby, who is right to emphasize that at this point the film is not simply ambiguous, it is clear but contradictory. That is to say, it generates two very clear but mutually exclusive meanings. They did it and they didn't do it. On the one hand, there was, in this brief fragment, there is a whole series of signals, codified signals, that they did it. That is to say that short shot of the tower, light tower, stands for a longer period of time. First, whenever in classical Hollywood the couple passionately embraces, and then this is followed by a fade out, it's standard codified way to say they did it. Second thing, the cigarette afterwards. You know, it's a codified sign, like the Hollywood saying, what is the second and the third most pleasant thing in life? The drink before and the cigarette after, and so on, and so on. Not to mention even the vulgar phallic meaning of the tower, and so on. Then there is a parallel series of features which signals that they did not do it. The bed in the background, or the couch rather, is undisturbed. The same conversation seems to go on without a break, and so on and so on. And it's interesting how, even when in the final conversation on the airport, before Victor Laszlo leaves with Ingrid Bergman, when we have the conversation between Rick, Humphrey Bogart, and Victor Laszlo, they directly touch these events of the night, and it's the same ambiguity. Let me quote you this very short dialogue. Rick, you said you knew about Ilsa and me. Victor, yes. Rick, you didn't know she was at my place last night when you were. She came there for the letters of transit. Isn't that true, Ilsa? Ilsa, yes. Rick, she tried everything to get them and nothing worked. She did her best to convince me that she was still in love with me. That was all over long ago. For your sake, she pretended it wasn't, and I let her pretend. Victor, I understand. Well, I don't understand, because what is Rick here saying? Is he saying that they had consummated the affair, so that in her attempt to convince him that she still loves him, or not? Maltby claims that Casablanca here, quote, deliberately construct itself in such a way as to offer distinct and alternative sources of pleasure to two people sitting next to each other in the same cinema. While at the level of its surface, explicit narrative line, the film can be constructed by the spectator as obeying the strictest moral codes, it simultaneously offers to the sophisticated spectator enough clues to construct an alternate, sexually much more daring narrative line. Where I only disagree with Maltby is that I think that it's not, we don't even need two spectators. That the way this shot works is that it addresses one spectator by telling you, I'm now putting it as kind of a prosopopoeia, ironically, we all know that you have your dirty desires, but we also know that superficially, at least, you have to pretend to obey moral, explicit regulations and so on. So here is what we will do. I, says the cinema to the spectator, I will offer you a narrative which can be read in an innocent way. Nothing happens. So that you can pretend in front of the big other, what's wrong? It's nothing. But at the same time, this will legitimize you to engage in all your dirty fantasies. I will provide you with the screen, what officially happened, and with all the background. Now, I think that the only thing we have to add to this is to go a step further. That is to say, it's not only that it allows for your illicit pleasures, you can imagine all the dirty things and so on, but it solicits them actively. it needs the dirty pleasures. That is to say, it's not, as some naive, transgressive leftist would have claimed, the official Hollywood texture is puritanical, but in a secret, subversive, undermining the movie in its deconstructionist gesture, undermining the ruling ideology, nonetheless passes its message. This ruling ideology is both. It's the explicit message and the obscene content. Ideology needs both. And I cannot resist from quoting you another famous from cinema literature dialogue between Josef von Sternberg and the bad guy, Breen, who was the boss of Hayes Code Office, when they debated a certain scene, which of course implies there was sex without showing it. And it's clear how from this dialogue, as Josef von Sternberg recorded it in his memoirs, how the obscene underside was part of the Hollywood game. Look the dialogue. Sternberg said, the director who wanted to do this film, I think it was of course with my God, who is the most famous German actress? Marlene Dietrich, yes, sorry. At this point, describing the scene to Breen, to the censor, at this point, the two principals have a brief romantic interlude. Breen interrupted him. What you are trying to say is that the two of them hopped into the hay and fucked. The indignant Sternberg answered, Mr. Breen, you offend me. Breen, oh, for Christ's sake, will you stop the horse shit and face the issue? We can help you make a story about adultery if you want, but not if you keep calling a good screwing match a romantic interlude. Now, what do these two people do? Kiss and go home? No, said Sternberg. They fuck. Good, yelped Breen, pounding the desk. Now I can understand your story. And so they made it. But you know, even Breen, the censor, wanted to know what really is supposed to happen to codify it properly. You need, this is, and we are talking about the top censor. He needed to know what is the prohibition, what is prohibited in order to codify it, to reconstruct it. So, again, my thesis here is that Hollywood is not only explicit Hollywood ideology, it's the distance itself, the distance towards the official ideology, which is, as it were, part of the game. You need also the implicit subtext. And my thesis, now back to Stalinist music, is that what if exactly the same holds for Shostakovich? What if the way the Stalinist music functioned was not simply you do the bombastic, realist, socialist music for those in power, but secretly you smuggle messages about despair, depression, irony, and so on? What if you need both? What if this was the ideal Stalinist music? I think this is the only way to explain a wonderful paradox that I read recently in a book on the other great Soviet composer, Prokofiev. Prokofiev couldn't understand what is going on. He was caught in the Stalinist superego when he stuck to his modernist roots and wrote contemporary music. He was accused of anti-people's formalism, bourgeois decadence, and so on and so on. But when, thereafter, he tried to do his best to follow the party line, and for example, when he did, in the late 30s, the cantata for the 20th anniversary of the October Revolution, setting to music texts by Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, you know what happened? The cantata was rejected as, quote, leftist deviation and vulgarity. Then he did it again. He quickly did something called Songs of Our Days, mixing party sing-alongs and folk tunes. Again, he was dismissed as the composition was not even performed. Zhdanov said, this is pale, lacking any sincere individuality. It's just cheap propaganda. So Prokofiev was simply, which incidentally was true, Comrade Zhdanov was right here, which Prokofiev didn't get it. Now, what's happening here? If I do the party line, if I do what I want to do, I'm accused of bourgeois individualism, psychologism, modernism, formalism. If I follow the party line, I'm confused of cheap leftism, just empty propaganda, and so on. He didn't get it. What's the true party order? Both. It's like Casablanca. They are just talking, and you have signal between the lines. They're having a good screw, and so on. Or like that. That, in other words, let me go on here to give you another. This is, I think, what accounts for this. It's a very interesting ideological phenomenon. If you follow Soviet music, fate of Soviet music today, they are, especially Shostakovich, tremendously popular today. But there is something, I claim, totally irrational going on recently. Namely, looking for the smoking gun, for some final private paper that would have demonstrated that Shostakovich really was a dissident. No? Maybe some of you know all the polemics about the so-called Volkov memoir, are they authentic or not, whatever. Why this terrible need to prove that secretly they were dissidents? Because if you accept the official line, in their sum of official work they made a compromise, composed Soviet cantatas, but then their real heart was this in dissident music, then you encounter a strange scandal, which doesn't work, which ruins everything. There is a massive scandal, which is that exactly the works which were found the greatest success, not only popular, but official success, Stalin prizes and so on, in the Soviet regime, are the works which are the most popular today in the West. The Fifth Symphony, ironic subtitle, a Soviet artist's just response to justified criticism and so on, like, is not only won Stalin Prize, immediate triumph, return of Shostakovich to favor. Do you know that even in the West, it's the most performed symphony in the entire 20th century? And so on and so on. Of Shostakovich chamber pieces, his piano quintet, wonderful piece in a light way, not very popular in the West. I'm very sorry, it got Stalin Prize in 1940 and so on. So, you know, there is a problem. How to do this? So, the way they solve the problem, these hermeneuticians, is to engage in this totally ridiculous Stalinist hermeneutics. Like, all the moments which are openly Stalinist have to be denounced as ironic. Like, no, he's really mocking kids and so on and so on. But what I claim is that what we should do is something slightly different. We should do what? Accept that this very gap between the two levels, in the same way that Hollywood is not only official Hollywood, but all these obscene innuendos and so on. In the same way, I claim, what the Stalinists wanted from composers is not some pure superficial propaganda, but they wanted this other dimension that we like so much today. Ooh, this is the true sincerity. There is another private dark dimension. Let me quote here, which is why this also accounts for many, many extremely strange events, like of Prokofiev. One of the commonplaces about Prokofiev is that in his last years, totally desperate, he withdraw to writing, as they put it, music for the drawer, not even to be performed. And usually the piece listed is his violin sonata in D major. You always say, oh, this is the secret music, despair, it was meant to sound like the wind in a graveyard, and so on, you know. Well, there is one extremely embarrassing fact. In 1947, this piece, dissident piece, dark, got the first order Stalin Prize.
Yeah.
And you know, to get the first order Stalin Prize, the guy himself must have liked it. So you get my point. I claim that the same gap that we find in the West, where, for example, everybody knows what is the shift from Ian Fleming to John le Carré. John le Carré introduced this psychological complexity. We should also show, like, the man who, if you ask me here, I read when I was young a Soviet official reply to The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, where they claimed this is the truly dangerous propaganda, precisely because it doesn't paint us as primitives and the West as simple, all potent winners like James Bond, but where you have, you know, the fiddler, the honest communist, there is an honest communist figure, and the Western side itself, the circus in Le Carré, is shown to brutally manipulate and so on and so on. This is the truly dangerous propaganda, where you allow for this human side so that the logic is nonetheless, in spite of this, our side basically good and so on. And my point is that in Stalinism also you need both sides. So my point is that, again, the question, okay, sorry, let me give you another example, a nice quote from Orlando Figes, Natasha's Dance, Russia's Cultural History, where this is the description of Shostakovich he provides. Just a quote. Since the Stalinist assault against Shostakovich music in 1936, Shostakovich had developed a sort of doublespeak in his musical language, using one idiom to please his masters in the Kremlin and another to satisfy his own moral conscience as an artist and a citizen. Outwardly, he spoke in a triumphant voice, yet beneath the ritual sounds of Soviet rejoicing, there was a softer, more melancholic voice, the carefully concealed voice of satire and dissent, only audible to those who had felt the suffering his music expressed. These two voices are clearly audible in Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, incidentally his greatest Stalinist hit, which received a half-hour ovation of electrifying force when it was first performed. Beneath the endless fanfares trumpeting the triumph of the Soviet state in the finale, the audience must have felt its sadness, and they responded to the music as a spiritual release. Well, I hope you got the incredible paradox of this description. It claimed that the other message, the dark message, despair, pessimism, was carefully concealed. Well, fuck it, carefully concealed but understood by everybody, by thousands and so on. As if, do you really think that the bureaucrats were such idiots, Zhdanov and so on, not to get what every listener got there? I mean, you know that he was a disgusting guy, but do you know that Zhdanov was a much more interesting character when there were these purges, anti-formalist campaign in 46, 47. You know what Zhdanov did once? Everybody was shocked. At a meeting in the Composers Union House, there was a piano, and Zhdanov sat behind the piano, took a piece by Shostakovich, played it the way it was, and then you said, this is how you should have done it to be more socialist, realist, and played, okay, a kitschy version, but a different version, and even used these technical terms, more ostinati, fortissimo here, and so on. So we are talking about horrible people, but don't make them idiots where they were not idiots. What I'm saying, again, is that obviously this doesn't work. A secret message which everybody gets. I mean, and again, works apparently of a protest, but works of a protest which ended up being celebrated by everybody. So I think, again, that what if something is terribly wrong here? What if the opposition is not simply, was Shostakovich the official composer, or did he have secret doubts and so on? What if he was an official composer precisely because of what Figes called this doublespeak? What if the party order was doublespeak? We want you official fanfares, but at the same time put all your private sheep, despair, doubts, and so on. We want that. Why? Because usually it is said that this private aspect is ironic. Ironizes the public message. Like when you have, I wanted to play to you, but it would take, I'm superstitious after today's experience even more. Something goes wrong. You see, I was playing too much with the cheaty lesson. The cunning of reason is that you can always trust that something will go wrong, and I got an answer from the real. Okay, what I wanted to say that, but what irony? Where is the irony here? What if it's not simply that Shostakovich has a private, ironical attitude towards the public message, like all that bombastic finale, but it's meant as mocking and so on. What if things function in a doubly reflected way. That is to say, let me repeat again a passage from Marx, which I always like to return to because I think it's Marx at his best. Marx with regard to how ideology works. Marx describes, you have it in almost all of my books, I'm sure you know it, if you know a little bit my work. Marx articulates the logic of the party of order, the conservative Republican Party, which was in power immediately after 1848 revolution in France. They were royalists, basically, the coalition of the two royalists, Orleanists, legitimists, but they had to pretend to be Republicans. Marx's point is the following one. They publicly followed the Republican line, but in all possible way they mocked it. They laughed at it, they all the time made royalist slips, made fun at the Republic, and so on and so on. But Marx's point is that the irony is not where they thought. They thought we just follow the Republican line, secretly we are royalists, we make fun. But the irony was double. The irony was that although they thought they were secretly royalists, objectively they functioned as Republicans. Their legislation, pro-bourgeois legislation, solidified the Republican capitalist order, and so on and so on. So again, you have a surface which you privately mock and so on. But the truth is nonetheless in the surface. Your distance is a false one. It's not that the true message is the surface, what you laugh at. And again, what if the same holds for Shostakovich? What if he mocks it? He mocks it, but at the same time, nonetheless, he does it. And what if, let me go even a step further, what if this is how in Stalinism also ideology functioned? What if they didn't want you really to identify with it? This is my old thesis. I developed it in one of my books that, for example, with socialist education, the idea was it was a dismal failure. The idea was to bring up, to elevate a new socialist personality, sacrificing himself for the others and so on, dedicated to humanity. What effectively the system produced were cynics who withdraw from public life, cared only about private pleasures. But wait a minute, what if this is what they really wanted? What if the ideal Soviet citizen, what if what those in power really were afraid of was citizens who took the ruling ideology too seriously and would then get engaged, and you never know where you get. You know, if you get engaged, then it's one step towards dissidence, no? When you get that things are really not like that. So I claim that I hope you got my point, that Shostakovich was the official. So this would be the Hegelian formula now. The very feature which distinguished Shostakovich's very distance from Soviet ideology, all these private traumas, irony, and so on, is what ultimately makes him a Soviet composer. Because it's interesting to see how I have a negative proof. There were a couple of, let's call them naively sincere communist, Marxist philosophers, cinema makers. They were either totally crushed, like maybe you know Chris Marker did a wonderful movie on him, Medvedkin. He was a kind of a absolutely sincere pro-Stalinist. All his works were prohibited and so on, no way. Then another example in philosophy, I don't know if you know the game, he's not an idiot. He wrote very intelligent things on Hegel. Evald Ilyenkov, the most tragic figure of Soviet philosophy. He was an impossible almost thing, a kind of a sincere communist Marxist. In 79, I think he killed himself. It was too horrible. It was simply, I mean, it was, he even couldn't get published, and it's really tragic now that they're opening his archive to see what the bureaucracy, the censors, what they were disturbed at. That precisely he really means it, that there is no ironic distance, no obscene message behind or whatsoever, and so on and so on. So that's the point, that this unity of the opposites, that precisely what you think it's your distance from it is the point where, as it were, you are included into the, where you are included into the thing. To give you here another example, which I use in my, I think, I forgot even which book, okay, it doesn't matter. It's you know Lars von Trier's Breaking the Waves. He has a nice Hegelian theory of why he shot the film the way he shot it. The wager is the tension, the proper dialectical tension between form and content. The content is romantic. It's a, you know, a crazy, passionate story. Emily Watson sacrifices kids. And he says, if I were to shoot the film in the way that would, if the form were to fit the content, it would simply appear ridiculous. He says, this is why he shot it in this dogma way, handheld camera, blurred image, and so on. That he claims that the only way for us to swallow this content, it's through this coldness of the form which distantiates it. So you see the point. In this sense, the form falls into content. That, how to put it, what appears to undermine content is the condition of possibility. The obstacle is not really the obstacle. The obstacle is the positive condition here. That's again the properly dialectical moment that I was trying to articulate. It's not the same as transcendental moment. The transcendental moment would have been the priority of form. It would have been to say, oh, von Trier is telling us a story, but he really wants to undermine the story, and that the truth is in the form. That the form makes fun of the content, the truth is in the form. But I think we have to make an additional tool. That what if the undermining of content is what enables, what renders the content palpable? You know, it's a little bit like the old example that I used, like in today's ironic era, I cannot say I love you, I appear ridiculous. Then I have to put it in an ironic way. As a poet would have put it, I love you, maybe I love you, and so on and so on. But this doesn't simply undermine it. It's the only way to pass the message. Okay, I've developed enough in my books on Christianity how this enters, for me, the Christian space where, again, the whole point is this same overlapping where the very distance is what throws you in. Like, for example, at the very point when you are radically divided from God, in the position of Job, or when Christ is abandoned, you are identified with God. That is to say, the Christian solution of the gap between a man and God is not somehow we overcome the gap, but it's that when you feel abandoned by God, the very gap that separates you from God is inherent to God himself. Because this is the position at which Christ found himself on the cross, blah, 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 blah. So you see the point. You don't overcome the gap. In the same way, I hope you saw the homology, that in the case of Shostakovich, the very gap that separates him from Soviet ideology makes him a Soviet ideologist. So now, nonetheless, let me do quickly, at least as much as possible, the last line, what I promised you, so that we get rid of religion and can go to politics 2 days from now. The man who was Thursday. You know what's the starting position? That mysterious, super secret Scotland Yard department and its boss, a mysterious chief, who is convinced that, a quote, a purely intellectual conspiracy threatens the very existence of civilization. Already the last time I read you a paragraph, I would just like briefly to read you another paragraph, wonderful. Quote, he, this mysterious boss, is certain that the scientific and artistic worlds are silently bound in a crusade against the family and the state. He has therefore formed a special corps of policemen who are also philosophers. It is their business to watch the beginnings of this conspiracy, not merely in a criminal, but in a controversial sense. The work of the philosophical policeman is at once bolder and more subtle than that of the ordinary detective. The ordinary detective goes to pothouses to arrest thieves. We go to artistic tea parties to detect pessimists. The ordinary detective discovers from a ledger or a diary that a crime has been committed. We discover from a book of sonnets that a crime will be committed. We have to trace the origin of those dreadful thoughts that drive men on at last to intellectual fanaticism and intellectual crime and so on and so on. I think but it's not as simple as that. What I claim is that this is not Chesterton's position. What he gets at the end is that it's not simply discern the universal, the true crime, the universal thought crime in particular crimes, but that in order for this to function, God himself has to be the supreme criminal. As you know, this is what happens in the novel towards the end, the discovery that this supreme police chief is the same as the boss of this council of the anarchists, and then he's reproached at the end when they confront him, got a very English-style remark by one of the detectives. It seems so silly that you, God, have been on both sides and fought yourself. In other words, that God is a Hegelian, fighting himself. And then, okay, we don't have time for all this line. Then Chesterton approaches the key problem here, which is, what does this mean, this coincidence of opposites? Does it mean simply that from our finite view, God appears both good and evil, but because we are split, but in itself, God is the unity, or is God in itself this gap, the highest contradiction, the highest pain? And Chesterton's answer is the second one. Why is this so interesting? Let me now conclude with a little bit on Meister Eckhart, who I think effectively is, here I agree, now I will say something horrible, but I like this shocking statement. Here, one of the most disgusting characters of 20th century was right, namely Alfred Rosenberg, you know, the Hitler's ideologist, when he says our Western mysticism beginning with the Rhine mystique of Meister Eckhart is the beginning of something different new. Don't ask me why, I think he was right. But I'm not original here, because they were even intelligent and progressive enough that in East Germany, Meister Eckhart was rehabilitated as the first dialectical materialist even, and so on and so on. Why? Which is the vision here of this notion of the tension, contradiction in God himself? It's not only that the tension, the highest pain, suffering is in God himself. It's much more. It is that the absolute gap that separates, as already said, us from God is inherent to God himself, which means that our alienation from God is God's self-alienation. That's for Hegel the message of Christianity. When we are abandoned by God, God is not up there. God loses himself, which means, and here is the terrible revolutionary potential, it's almost the opposite of the standard notion of teleology where you say, oh, whatever we are doing, somehow we can count on God to help us. No, it's not us who is helping God. I think the ultimate Christian attitude, which is very revolutionary here, is, as Paul Claudel, a conservative, put it, God is helpless without us. We should be aware that when we are fighting for, and this is what Benjamin will say, that God's fate is decided in revolution. It's not only in a particular revolution, it's not only a revolution, as if the fate of much more universal is, and the one who first formulated this idea that, again, we are God's sorrow. Through us, God suffers. Eckhart did it. Eckhart was the one who shattered the very dualism between God and his creatures. This is to be taken literally. It's not just these platitudes that God becomes man and so on. It is not just that God gives birth or creates two or creates men. It is also not only that, this is the standard pantheist platitude, that God gives, that only through and in man God becomes fully God. It is that man himself gives birth to God. God is nothing outside man, although this nothing is not simply a nothingness. but the abyss of Godhead, and so on and so on. Now, one should be here very precise. Eckhart, if you allow me this last line of thought, Eckhart distinguishes between God and Godhead, Gottheit. I think Gottheit, he is a non-God. He calls it Unding, a non-thing. But again, I think this has to be read as the Kantian infinite judgment. It doesn't mean no God. It means God which is no longer only God, like the undead. So what happens here? The idea is that God needs man in order to reach himself, that in man God is born. Holy Ghost means a moment when in man God is born. How? A wonderful quote from his sermons. God has such a need to seek us out, exactly as if all his Godhead depended on it, as in fact it does. God can no more dispense with us than we can dispense with him. Even if it were possible that we might turn away from God, God could never turn away from us. So what this means is that the only sight of God is our soul, as Eckhart puts it. Another quote, in my eternal birth, all things were born, and I was cause of myself as well as all things. If I had willed it, neither I nor any things would be. And if I myself were not, God would not be either. That God is God, of this I am a cause. If I were not, God would not be God. So what this paradox involves is Eckhart's fundamental mystical insight. While a human being has a center outside it, in God, he accepts this. But he adds, there must also be a corresponding eccentricity in God himself. That God also has his center outside himself. The eccentricity of man is the self-eccentricity of God. So that God can relate to himself, abolish his eccentricity only through man. Here, again, we have this totally crazy theory of Eckhart, where he even goes as far to say that we should not be grateful to God for his love. He said God is stupid substance. God is basically, he's kind of a subjectivized Spinoza already. He gives an incredible twist, Eckhart, to the idea, what does it mean that Christ suffers from us? None of this paying the price for our sins. The idea is simply this one. God is the only substance that there is. Our soul is nothing. We are virgin, but virgin, he doesn't mean no sex. He means the opposite. For him, it is wonderful. Mother is the only true virgin. Only a virgin can give birth. Why? Because to give birth means you empty your soul of all empirical shit, material, and so on. At that moment, you give birth. The Holy Spirit, which is the Godhead, is born in you. But God as such is not this abyss of spiritual Godhead. God is just, I'm consciously vulgarizing him here, but he says this in a way. God is the substance of being. All there is God. And when you become virgin, what he calls virginity is this mystical withdrawal, where you withdraw from reality. And at that point, you no longer suffer, but God suffers for you. But this only means the matter, things suffer, you are no longer there. I mean, you withdraw from reality, God is all reality, because for Eckhart, God is literally all reality. It's not that God is higher reality and then this table, for example, is a lower reality. All that is God. So then, if you withdraw from reality, from all that is, and accept this position of Gelassenheit, of releasement, where you are nothing, of course you don't suffer. God suffers, but this means out there you are not identified with it. But this God who suffers, it's just the stupid reality. It's only through your release into nothingness that God is born in you. But this God who is born in you is nothingness itself. And I really think that here we have the birth, in a way, of modern subjectivity. Where, and that's crucial, the crucial Hegelian move. Yes, and my God, you found them wonderful, I don't have time here, paradoxes here in Eckhart. For example, when he says, God is stupid, God loves us like a dog, dog moves his tail, has to love us, it's his nature, God is nature. We don't have to be grateful. He says, God cannot order us anything. God just does what is in his nature to do. God cannot help us. God cannot help loving us. He says, no, God can just follow what he does, and it is us who can order God. It's our duty to order things to God. God is stupid. He does what he can. He cannot. It's an absolutely breathtaking view, which I think is profoundly Christian. He takes it seriously that nature, materialist vision, out of nature, you withdraw into nothingness. Out of this nothingness, the Holy Spirit arises, which is just this void as the spiritual space for something new, collective action to emerge, and so on, and so on. So again, now you will say, but what is the difference between this radicality and a simple materialism? When you say, okay, so what's the big deal? We know it, God doesn't exist, we give birth to God. No, it's not as simple as that. It's that, it's not, how do you put it, the catch, what misses the usual materialism is precisely this dimension of how your alienation from the substance, from God's substance, the thing itself, is a cut, a split in the thing itself. Of how, what I developed apropos, for example, of Stalinism, the formal logic is the same. How, precisely when we are alienated from the state, like the Soviet artist was, this is what makes us members of the state. That is to say that the pain, our struggles, are not only our struggles. The fate of the absolute is decided in our struggles. It's a very anthropocentric vision, but I think it is the deepest ethical vision. It is the vision which also sustains this horror at the Holocaust, where, this idea of when something as horrible as Holocaust happens, isn't there, and many who survived it reported on this very existential experience, which tells you, but isn't there something obscene that you witness Holocaust and then you go out and the sun is still there? It's as if when something so horrible happens, somehow the sun should stop shining. This idea that our struggles are not only our struggles, that the fate of everything depends of us, this extreme point of responsibility. And even Habermas is here, right, I quote him somewhere, who says that who says against this stupid argument against theology, which is, but how could God have allowed so many people to be killed in Gulag and blah, blah. Habermas is intelligent enough to point out that this, far from simply being an argument against God, if there is a good God and omnipotent, he would never allow it. On the contrary, this is why we need some kind of a reference to divine dimension, because when you translate these terrifying crimes into simple human language of, oh, this guy was bad and so on, it's not strong enough. It's the very horror of these crimes which calls for another dimension. Of course, the whole point is to read it not as God in the sense of religion. But I call this dimension precisely the Freudian dimension of the undead and so on, whatever. So my point is that in order to give a materialist version, the lesson from Hegel, of religion, it's not simply to say, but God is truly man, but it's to introduce, we need something more than human. But this more than human, of course, is not God, but it's what I called, what we call the undead and so on, that there has to be a gap. God is in the same way as I already developed that the universal is nothing but the gap that separates the particular from itself. What religion calls God is the non-coincidence of man to itself, the gap within humanity. So again, what I'm pleading for is, as a legacy of religious attitude, is this much more radical messianic attitude, not any guaranteed messianic optimism or whatever, but in this sense of great action, anti-postmodernism. Our struggles, you know, that this, all the universe hangs on. Our struggles are the center. This idea of the fate of the universe is decided in our struggle. This idea of, how to put it, ethical justification of universe. But okay, from this I will pass to the ethics of intellectuals the next time. What I will not use here, because I don't want to repeat myself and we don't have enough time, is I wanted to give one talk on Islam. But then I remembered, my God, that in a moment of stupidity, I gave it to my friend in New York who put it on the web. So go to Lacan.com, there you can find it, to be fair, if you are interested in this reading of Islam. So that, okay, I'm sorry I couldn't go further here, but I hope you just get this paradoxical move where the loss, the distance itself includes you into the thing. This basic paradox of the Lacanian real. From this we go to praising Heidegger and so on. My point, just to give you, is that it's wrong to ask what was, I think that, of course, Heidegger did a horrible thing, but I claim that the difference is minimal. He did almost the right thing, I claim. It's wrong to, oh, everything that must have been wrong, and so on and so on. No, one should fully accept, for example, if you look at the Heidegger structure of temporality and so on, my God, it's or historicity, how close it is to Benjamin and so on. I mean, we shouldn't be afraid of saying almost everything is right in Heidegger. But then he adds something which turns everything into shit. But no reason to drop everything. I think we should reject this liberal blackmail of, oh, Heidegger did that, so he's off. That's what I will try to do in parallel with Nietzsche and who was the other one? Sorry, and Foucault. Next time, and at the end, a little bit of, like, the title of the last one could have been Prospects of Stalinist Politics Today, or something. Thanks very much.